All right, I'd like to welcome you to Urban Ed Week's second event. And this is the event entitled Courageous Conversations, Understanding Critical Race Theory. And today I have an esteemed panel from all over the country and yet even the world. And I'm going to give them a chance to introduce themselves, starting with Dr. Tehia Glass.
Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Tehia Glass. I'm an associate professor of elementary education and educational psychology, also the director of diversity and inclusion for the Cato College of Education at UNC Charlotte.
Dr. Thomas.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Stephanie Thomas. I am an assistant professor at Lenore University and the Master's in Art of Teaching coordinator in our Asheville Graduate School campus.
Dr. Williams.
Hello, my name is John Williams III from Texas A&M University. I'm an assistant professor in urban education and multicultural education.
And Dr. Showunmi.
Hey, hi, good evening or good afternoon, everybody. So I'm associate professor at University College London. I'm really pleased to be with you. I'm also the chair of the Athena Swan for my faculty, which is a gender equality initiative, and I'm taking them through the silver, which is looking at really transformational change. So that's a little bit about me, but I'm sure you'll find out more as the time goes on. Thank you very much, Stephen.
You're welcome. So once again, welcome everyone to this discussion. It is a very candid discussion, and it's a discussion that is designed to help teachers, students, principals, and parents understand what critical race theory is. And so what we wanted to begin to do is first go through some topic questions before we go into questions from students, parents, and educators. So I'm going to jump right on in it because we have a short period of time here. The first question I'm going to open up with Dr. Glass. And that question is, what is critical race theory? And then what are the main components?
So critical race theory began over 30 years ago with scholars in the law profession or the law field, Derek Bell, Crenshaw, Harris, Delgado, Williams, and then Latson, Billings, and others then took that law theory and moved it into education, or used that same framework or theory in education. And so I want to be clear again that this theory is over 30 years old. It is not something that has happened within the last 5 or 6 years or last year or two, which, some of the commentary that we hear often these days. This is a theory that has been used over 30 years. And so parts of that theory, or the main components of that theory, is acknowledging that race is socially constructed. Number one, race is not something that is biologically used, but it is something that humans created to create essentially hierarchies of power. Another component of critical race theory is that race is a normal feature of society. It is baked into every system and every institution. And so what we hear often are mainstream ideas or neutral concepts or thoughts, or normal, what is normal and what is not. And what we are saying, or what the theory is saying, is when we are considering what is normal, it is also within this framework of race, which means there is some degree of a hierarchy of who has power and then who does not. Critical race theory also acknowledges the systemic nature of racism. And I want you all to hear me saying not individual, right? Not that person who was disrespectful or unkind to another person, but the ways in which racism is baked into our systems. And because it is baked into those systems, or, racism informs those systems, it reproduces inequities and inequalities. Another component of critical race theory is the acknowledgement of people of color, or Black people in particular, in Bell's context, of counter narratives, right? So making sure that we understand that there are other perspectives, which we would probably consider like non-mainstream, but in any system or situation that there are counter narratives. There are other people's experiences that don't fit what that norm is. And those are the stories that we need to hear more of. Another component is this idea of interest convergence, or an outcome of it is interest convergence, meaning that there are institutions, there are people, there are systems that will only address racism if it is mutually beneficial, right? If there's some type of opportunity. Lots of conversation happens around Brown v. Board of Ed and the ways in which we finally did desegregate schools, because the rest of the world was kind of looking at us like, you know, you all want to impact the rest of the world and deciding what's right or wrong, but then look at your own country in terms of all the segregation that you have going on. And so lastly, it is a theory to examine and challenge racism that exists individually to systemically, and making sure that we are addressing race, talking about race, including race in all of our conversations, because it is a part of our history and it should occur on a regular basis for, you know, any of the conversations, any of the inequities or disparities that we see in healthcare, housing, economics, schools, so on and so forth.
Thank you, Dr. Glass. Now, Dr. Showunmi, being in London, I know that you've heard the commentary here in the United States, understanding what parents are saying about critical race theory. Could you give us an insight on how it looks in London and how people understand it there?
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. How it looks, they are really conflating and confusing the whole issue of critical race theory based on how it's been developed and confused within the arguments at the present moment in the US. So there's not much difference. I suppose the only difference is, well, I don't even know if that's a difference actually, is that they, within Parliament, whereas you're doing that within your government as well, they are using Black members of Parliament, which is of course our political members, which are there to say how much they dislike a CRT. But again, similar to yours, with no understanding at all, and how they then start giving stories about how that in itself is affecting or impacting on their children. So you've got that going on. You've also got, we've got, I've got to be very careful when I say this, but we have some of the other equalities, let's use those words, who are also kind of connecting to the discussion, and with a kind of, so what about us scenario when we're also talking about that. So that's coming on. And I think the biggest thing is that the our government is a conservative government, and there is quite a lot of evidence that anything which perhaps has CRT or other issues like feminist movement or issues around sociological approaches to anything in society, they're trying to kind of block it and stop it from occurring. So I think that's a big thing. Understanding, well, more and more students are wanting to do the work in this particular area. My area, I'm a feminist, all right? So my area is feminism, and feminist theory has always been storying. So to me, it's easy to work with my students around this when they understand the counter stories and the lived experience and how that in itself becomes narrative. So the more they push against it, the more students are asking, so what is this? Schools are asking, so what is this? What do we need to do to be able to understand this? So hopefully that's a very short answer for you, Stephen.
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm going to go to John and ask him now. Dr. Glass has given us a brief history, but I'm going to ask Dr. Williams if he could give us a little bit more history, and then why and how was CRT developed, so that families, parents, teachers, and educators can understand why this was developed, and if you can add on to that history, that as well.
So thank you for the question. I think the biggest thing, just to follow what Dr. Glass is saying, that the whole notion of this counter narrative, of things that were always going on, particularly in the Black experience, that we all kind of knew, but it was not articulated at such a grand level. So when Derek Bell brought this up, Crenshaw brought this up, it was because legal studies was not articulating race. And to be clear, it wasn't just out of the air. Critical race theory, while it's 30 years old, the groundwork for it was being built by the Baldwins of the world, by the Ida B. Wells of the world, by the Du Bois of the world. We have so much, I mean, that's like over 150-year history of saying that, hey, race has always mattered. And then Bell said, you know what, it's matter and it's maturing. And this is the ways that we should view it as a lens. And I think that's the one thing that people forget when it comes to theory. It's a lens. It's how you change that lens and what ways you move it. It can determine what you're actually looking at. And Derek Bell said, hey, you know, we need to focus on race and how it's impacted as a social construct, as I said, as a makeup thing that has impacted people on all types of levels. When Gloria Latzer-Billings and Tate brought it over, they drew it down to education and specifically focusing on the numerous inequities that had occurred since this country basically was taken over. And when people want to have the conversation about the historical precedents of why critical race theory has kind of always existed, but you have to look at whose land are we sitting on right now? Whose land are we sitting on right now? And that kind of centralizes the whole, and I love the notion, it's baked in the cake. Even from the foundation of what this country was built on, it's built on that. So as it's gone through numerous years and, you know, people have used it, again, it's a lens to look at how race has impacted just, you know, educational outcomes, the opportunity gap, access to advanced classes, access to even, you know, affordable healthcare. But if you really want to specifically deal with education, how do we even access the classrooms or the buildings that students are going to be into? And it's often been decided by race, which has often been decided by things like property taxes. But we also know that that's connected back to race. So it's all these things, it's just centering that part of the conversation with race. And again, it's a theory, it's a lens. It's not something to be used that is saying counter against someone else, like Dr. Glass says, or individual. Is it a lens to review race and how it's impacted individuals at a societal institution on a global level?
I think that's a good point for parents, teachers, and students to really get that it's a lens. It is not a tool to be used to harm or deconstruct or even reconstruct. It's simply a lens to look at. This idea of looking at these things through the lens of critical race theory may help people understand and not fear it or demonize it as it has been in our society. So we're going to bring that now, that this idea of critical race theory, this history of it, this development of it, and now, as you said, Dr. Williams, bringing this thing down into the classroom, how Latzer-Billings, Tate, and others have brought it down into the classroom. And so the burning question that teachers are asking and everyone is asking, is critical race theory used in the classroom? And so I'm going to go to Dr. Glass on that and then follow up with Dr. Thomas.
No.
Just emphatic no.
It is, critical race theory is not being used in classrooms to indoctrinate or, you know, all those things that we continue to hear. You know, again, looking at the theory, this was something that I learned in graduate school. So it is a way in which we see the world. But at this point, if we are using critical race theory and it's in the essence of what it is, we probably wouldn't have all these disparities that we have, right? If we were really using critical race theory and we were looking at the disproportionality of, you know, Black students in special ed or how our trans and our LGBTQ students are being treated, then there would actually be some equity there because we are listening to their narratives and their stories. And then we are then trying to essentially kind of fix education, fix the system so that they are welcome, they belong, they are able to do well. We see the humanity in all of them. So, you know, ultimately, I don't believe that critical race theory is used in schools as a way to indoctrinate or, you know, we're not even doing a great job of just addressing the disparities that exist for kids. I think more of what we're doing is more of that diversity where we're just trying to help children, help students understand the world that they live in, both historically and contemporarily, but really like fixing and addressing the systems that are issues. No, we are not doing that. So I don't think that critical race theory is something that is used in school. So I will defer to Dr. Thomas to elaborate a little more on it, and then I'll jump back in.
Yeah, so like our kids aren't going to be going to school and having like, hey guys, let's open up our book and learn about critical race theory. That's not going to happen. There's not going to be a panel speaker or a field trip to the Critical Race Theory Museum. That's not going to ever happen. That's not a thing. And I think that should help us breathe and exhale and realize like, hey, there's ways that we can talk about race and things related to, but we're not going to necessarily have like a lesson or guided practice or some type of workshop or activity with children in K through 12 about critical race theory. Now, it can be used to explain, like Dr. Glass said, about the disparities and just some of the examples of disparities that Gloria Lansing-Billings kind of highlights is that, you know, the curriculum, like just think about how the curriculums can be very white-centered and white savior. And I taught history, so I had to really battle that a lot as a social studies teacher, middle school, just thinking like, okay, why is everything from the European perspective? Why are we not looking at the world from the Afrocentric perspective or Latino perspective or, you know, any other diverse group? And definitely how as our curriculums, you know, reinforcing stereotypes. We're getting ready to head in Thanksgiving. What's going to happen for Thanksgiving, everybody? How y'all going to talk about it? We're going to talk about the truth, or we're going to do the Pilgrims and Indians and paper bag activity. You know, let's talk about like, what does that even look like? And also, you know, we think about different instructional strategies that assume that Black children are inferior or less than and stupid. We need to like scale that back because we're not. and then I'm just thinking about like school funding, how funding, there's lots of different funding disparities within schools that are majority Black. And Jonathan Colesall has a book called Savage Inequalities I used with my students this semester. And it really did break down a lot about like, hey, let's look, where does the money reside? Does the money reside in predominantly white schools, or does it reside in predominantly Black schools? And we can see that there's a lot of disparities that the critical race theory like brings to the surface that we can look at our society and be like, oh, wow, that's racist. Oh, that's not good. And that's what we need to really dismantle and get rid of. But no, you won't have a critical race theory homework assignment that comes home in your child's backpack that says, hey, do this and turn this in 100 words or less and get it signed by a parent. That's just not a thing. But what is a thing is all the disparities that it illuminates. And that is actually in our locus of control to change.
All right, so both you and Dr. Glass, and even Dr. Williams, that all of you all, and Dr. Showunmi have said the D word, and that word is diversity. And so I'm going to put a pin in that because that's a very interesting question, the relationship between this idea of diversity or DEI and critical race theory. But before we go on there, I'm going to ask you, Dr. Thomas, and as well as Dr. Showunmi, do colleges of education train teacher educators on critical race theory? So I go with you first, Dr. Thomas.
I wish they did. I wish they did more of that. I think Lansing-Billings kind of reminds us that, you know, it lives in educational research. It is a PhD level theory that applies to research, right? It's not something that lives outside of that. And that's actually not necessarily a benefit. You know, I think what needs to live outside of it are the practices and the systemic changes that result from the research that the critical race theory is applied to. So like, for instance, in like, when we think about, you know, teacher education, are the student teachers, especially, you know, the white student teachers really deconstructing their own racism and really seeing like, how does that affect my students, especially my students who may not look like me? Are we talking about race in the diversity class that our college students in education are taking, or is it saturated in like all the classes, like laid out like a 7th course meal, and in each class, you know, it's like you get the soup, the salad, the main dish, the dessert. Is it laid out throughout, or is it condensed in one? That definitely needs to be addressed. We also think about how our schools that are majority Black like positioned within student teaching experience? Are these like the urban scary schools, like the Title I schools? And oh, be careful when you go there. Or like, how are we perpetuating that in teacher education? Or are we saying like, let's leverage the assets in these Black schools? Let's look at the communities that these Black schools are thriving in. And let's say like, hey, Black schools with majority Black kids actually can thrive. And there's many schools that are doing that. And are we perpetuating like those positive things in the College of Ed when we're training teachers? And also I'm thinking when we think about like the curriculum in teacher of ed, like how are we even dismantling how that is even European centered and whitewashed? Because, you know, we kind of have to go back to just like that foundation. Like if we're using the same whitewashed curriculum to develop teachers, you know what you're going to end up with, you know what I mean? So we really kind of think about, yes, teacher education should talk about critical race theory. It does not need to just live in the idea of research. It can actually be enacted when we think about the systemic things that need to be changed. And yes, teachers who are going on into the classrooms, and whether they are diverse or not, need to be aware of themselves. They need to be prepared to teach students that look different from them. And if they are a white teacher that goes to all white school, great. Teach them about how to be anti-racist. You know, there's no place where it cannot live. So I definitely, you know, I know, and I don't know for all of us who are working with future teachers, that we don't want it to just live in a research project, but we want it to kind of permeate in the way that we are dismantling systemic racism in teacher education.
All right, and so I'm going to move over to across the water and ask Dr. Showunmi. So does your university teach CRT to teacher candidates?
It does actually, yeah. It's not a separate subject as such within, because we call it PGCE, postgraduate teacher training or teacher education. And so there's levels in that. We've also got Teach First, like Teach America with you, but we're winding up our Teach First in our particular university. So going back to the question, so for example, there's a module. So students will have, like many other places, will have a particular element, a particular time when they will be taught something around, in quotes, diversity. So that's when it's coming in there for their teacher training. However, when they're doing their masters and there's teachers which are wanting to do and look at CRT, they're actually they're able to come on a module, which is one of my modules, which is called Sociology of Race and Education. And that's where they're able to really kind of unpack and start to learn about CRT. But I must also mention, and this may be a little bit of a curveball, put it in there, that as I said before, I'm a feminist. So my work will also about critical feminist theory. So I will expose them to CRT at the same time as critical feminist theory as well, because I think they need to understand about what's going on with Black women in the same time, because sometimes we lose sight of that because we are concentrating on race, which we want to do, but at the same time, we need to also concentrate on what's going on with women. So, and that's where I'm very much, I want the two to come together. So I look at the two in that particular module. So the answer to your question in a roundabout way is yes, they do have an option, but that's at master's level. We don't teach them CRT in my university as a subject letter session within their teaching, but conscious teachers who are teaching teachers will mention it, but it's not something which is separate.
Good, and I think that is a very good point that everyone must take. The teachers that are teaching your children do not understand CRT. Therefore, CRT is not in schools. And I think that connection has to be clear and has to be made for families, for parents, and even for politicians, that if a teacher doesn't understand it, because in undergraduate education here, they don't get it. It is a master's, PhD level type of discussion and theory. If you're not giving it to undergraduate teachers, then how can they bring it into the classroom? So then that begs the question, what is going on in the classroom And what does what is this fuss about, right? Did you have something to inject?
I just wanted to say one last thing about that, actually, because there was something which took place, and I decided I'm a bit of an disruptor on certain things when I have time to be. And there was a session which was being done recently on uniform, on school uniform. And one of my colleagues who's a white feminist, and we know each other, she's an American. No, she's not, she's Canadian. So she'd ran this session, and I decided to get in there and be a disruptor, interrupter on it. And it was about gender neutral school uniform. I wanted to really go in there with a lens, which one would say was a CRT lens, and see what they were doing, because I knew it would be a white space, but I wanted it to be more than a white space. I wanted it to have the voices of Black young people in there, particularly young girls. And I went in there with a lived experience because I'm interested in what's going on with a young girl who's 16, 6'2", and is trying to deal with the school uniform. We have school uniform policy, whereas all they're talking about really is about all girls should wear trousers. I'm being a bit essentialist as such. All girls, well, actually, some girls want to wear a skirt, but when they've got legs which are 38 inches and they're wearing a school skirt, it looks like a mini skirt. So all those things. So why do I mention that? It's a lived experience, and it's really looking at the lens of what's going on in the school. So the schools are all jumping up and down. Yes, 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 we need to do gender neutral, blah, 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 which is really, really good to be able to do. However, what does that look like when we're looking at young Black women or young Black men? How do we do that as well? Just wanted to say that.
Right. So, and I think that is very important. Dr. Glass was going also into this idea of critical race theory, moving into this intersectionality theory, right? Dealing with the other components. But we want to begin to really open up this, this box to make sure that families, parents, particularly, and students, and even teachers with undergraduate degrees understand that critical race theory is not a threat. It is a theory, as Dr. Williams says, it's a lens that we're going to use to view things. No one said it's critical race theory activism or critical race theory action or critical race action, right? It is not, it's not in that space. So at this moment, I'm going to open it up to the group for questions. So if you have a question, please just tap it into the chat and I will pull up. I do have questions already that have come in. And so these are questions, and I'll let you know if it's from a parent, a student, or an educator, and if it's a principal or a teacher. This is, the first one is from a teacher. Now, when you answer the question, remember you're talking to educators. So let's try and make sure it's clear for them. This teacher asked, if I'm talking about race and racism during the Harlem Renaissance with my 10th graders, is that critical race theory? Why? And I open that up to anyone who wants to jump into that. Dr. Thomas, since that's your space, social studies.
Yeah, so no, it's not. It's not critical race theory. It's the Harlem Renaissance. And you're talking about racism in the Harlem Renaissance. And I think, you know, one of the things that we need to kind of roll back is just, let's keep it real simple. Let's keep critical race theory where it is. And let's keep the topics what they are, right? So this is a topic that talks about race, but it's not synonymous. Yeah, I mean, I just want to keep it simple and keep it right there.
Okay, good. Anybody else want to respond to that?
I just want to, I guess, add or expand that a bit. I think what we have been seeing going on in our country and probably internationally is that folks are conflating talking about race as being critical race theory, and it is not. So, you know, to Stephanie's point, this teacher is talking about the Harlem Renaissance, period. Like, that is not critical race theory. We are actually talking about events that happened in our country. And I would hope that that teacher is teaching with some historical accuracy, meaning, you know, the perspectives and the stories and the experiences of, you know, Black folks in that time frame who are sharing their stories about the Harlem Renaissance. So we can't get caught up in, you know, conflating the two. And I think that's where teachers are a little hesitant or even afraid to teach what they have essentially been trained to do, right? If we look at our Common Core standards, or even some of the, the back and forth with our new social studies standards in the state of North Carolina, like, we should be talking about the realities and the history that has happened both, in our state and our country. And so we can't conflate the two. I'll stop there.
Got it. And I have a question that just came in. So what are some suggestions do you have for educators to reclaim the term so that it can be effectively used as a theoretical framework? So what are these suggestions? How do we reclaim critical race theory as a theoretical framework?
I think it just takes a good understanding for ourselves of what it is, so we can explain to others the difference between having historically accurate conversations and lessons about our history, about our country or state or city, community, so on and so forth, and what critical race theory is. So we need to have a good understanding for ourselves, because we see all of the fear mongering going on. We see the ways in which these conversations at school board meetings and, in the media are kind of conflating them. And we have to help our teachers know it well enough for themselves to see, like, no, there is a distinct difference between the two. So they can understand it for themselves and then be able to defend themselves or talk to their principal about it, help their principal have a good understanding, because the principal needs to have the teachers back when they are doing, their lessons, so on and so forth. So I think it begins with a good understanding for ourselves, which I think is, a large premise of why we're here right now doing this panel, is to equip our parents and our teachers to have a thorough and well-researched, knowledge base of this, so that they can go, talk to other teachers, talk within their communities, so that they have a good understanding of it to be able to defend what they're doing in their classrooms or in their homes.
Thank you. Anybody else want to give any suggestions on how we reclaim critical race theory?
I'll add on to that, because I'm teaching social theory right now, so a lot of my doc students are in the midst of it. The first thing I always tell them, because they get approached, is it's 4-letter words, very simple. READ, read. Have you read the original? That's the first question I ask him. I say, have you read the original works? That's how we start this conversation out, because if we're not starting off at the same level, we're talking over each other, under each other. Have you read Derek Bell's work? Well, no, here. Faces at the Bottom of the Well. Here you go. It's a great book. It's something you can read at your leisure time. Take your time, your favorite drink, read it. Next, have you read Gloria Ladson-Billings and Tate? No, you haven't? Okay, we need to read, because a lot of what's happening right now, that stops 90% of the questions. Have you read? And as great educators, what do we tell our students? To read, then come and ask for instruction. So I think that's a little bit how we get to navigate this space, and kind of, as I say, critical race theory, it's not the boogeyman, it's not Candyman, it's not any of those. If you read about it, it is very explicit. And then the scholars who have put things out have given a more, I don't want to say watered down version, but a more practitioner version of it. But that requires the people to know these things, so that way when we have these conversations, we're all talking at the same level. We're all talking the same language. We're using the same terminology, because we could be using two different things talking over each other. And that's a lot of what we're getting right now, is this dust up, because as Dr. Ladson-Billings left at the end of her article, she said, my fear is that it's just going to be ed research, and it's going to get watered down and shaken up, and it'll sit there and it'll be used not for the way it's supposed to be used. So the thing I always tell everybody, go back and read, because that'll give you a better understanding, not only what it is, but why Derek Bell and Crenshaw, they came up with it, and why Ladson-Billings and Tate actually pushed it forward. And again, just a side note, Ladson-Billings and Tate, when they came up with this, they did just come out of nowhere with it. They actually piloted it in front of all types of practitioners, professors, and Gloria Ladson-Billings said herself, they came out and gave constructive feedback. So this is not something that was just half-baked. It actually received feedback from other scholars in a very conservative place. But they thought this would help move us the field forward as a lens, again, as a lens.
Thank you very
I
much.
want to say, can I add, Stephen, that
Yeah.
both Derek Bell and Gloria Ladson-Billings articles are publicly accessible, right? So they're not behind a paywall. A simple Google Scholar search, oftentimes you'll be able to access it. I know also if you go to, I'll have to find it. There's a really good website that Kimberly Crenshaw put a bunch of resources up online as well to help people be informed, right? To have that informed knowledge. So I'll find the link and I'll put it in the chat.
All right, another question that has come across, and I have a couple of student questions and some parents and some principals, but here's another question that I want to also bring out. This idea of critical pedagogy that is already in schools, right? So one listener asked, please talk about the relationship between critical consciousness dimensions of critical pedagogy. And what does that look like and how it relates to CRT? Dr. Thomas?
Well, I think the critical consciousness is my most exciting place because when it comes to really looking at a critical eye, why are we learning what we're learning? From whose perspective is it from? Are we incorporating various voices? And so when it comes to like culturally relevant teaching, we know that culturally relevant teaching really has what the critical consciousness, understanding multiple cultures, and then teaching to mastery are like those three main components. And so when we think about the critical consciousness, yes, we do want to be critical. And I think that's where critical race theory can help, because it does put on like the glasses, the lens that we need to look at the world, how we're educating our children, how we're preparing our teachers. And it does say like, hey, let's look at what we're doing and let's actually analyze it and see where there's some gaps, where can we improve, and how can we better prepare teachers for students. And so through that, yes, critical consciousness can come naturally, because as, for instance, as a history teacher teaching, like I think the earlier question was about the Renaissance, if you're thinking about it from that critical lens, you will analyze the curriculum that talks about the Renaissance. Are they including all the voices in the Renaissance? Are they looking at the Renaissance from a particular lens that may not even reflect your students? And so I think those two things come really hand in hand when we want to make our curriculums relevant to our students. So I'll just leave it at that. I see Dr. Showunmi has her hand up.
Go ahead, Dr. Showunmi.
I just wanted to add something else to the discussion as well, which I think links with Stephanie as well. What she's saying is that we use first names in the UK. So if I say first names, we use first names. Doesn't matter how high up you are up the chain, we still use first names. All right. So I noticed there's a difference there. So if you don't mind, if I've just said your name, I think one of the things which we do need to look at with the elephant in the room, and I bring the elephant in the room itself, is about ourselves, and it's about where we're at. I mean, how can we be doing CRT if we're not comfortable with who we are as individuals? And I think that is fundamental. We can easily, push out and say, yes, all teachers need to be developing and be educated in how to do CRT. But we also need to take a step back and acknowledge that some people aren't ready and they need to do the work on themselves. And it's how do we then hold their hands, if you want to hold their hands or whatever you want to do, to ensure that they become ready. Yes, reading, of course, is one thing, watching different things, but also shadowing us, getting us to come in and work with you is another thing. Having parents groups to be able to, have the conversation, because sometimes people just don't know how to have the conversation about, well, what is CRT? How does that connect with this theory? How did it connect with that theory? And some of them are so intertwined anyway, and that's okay to be able to have that. But if you don't do the work and ask your questions, well, who am I? And what does that mean? Then it's going to be very difficult because it doesn't stick. You've got to go deep on you to be able to do that. And also recognize not everybody is able to teach this area. Not everybody is able to be kind of passionate about it. But the key thing is being aware of it, at the same time working on yourself. And I think that's something which we haven't touched on as yet. And I don't think there's any questions which were around that neither. So maybe something.
I think what you did was a very good explanation of another strategy that really works if we're going to reclaim CRT. So the initial question talking about what are the strategies, Dr. Williams says we need to just simply read to reclaim this. But I think what you're saying is an excellent strategy that we also must begin to discuss this, first of all, but most importantly, need to have this critical autobiography, this critical self-look. Do we really understand it? Not just, personally us as faculty who actually teach it, but in the community. So before you jump up in a board meeting, do you really understand your dispositionality, who you are, and how it relates to this work? And so I think that's a very good strategy also to add to this space. There's another question that just came across, but I also have a question from a parent. And I'm going to allow whoever wants to jump on this. This is one of the questions that really a lot of parents have. This parent says, how do I support my child's learning about race in America and not make her feel guilty about being white? And that is a stickler point. So I see Dr. Glass has jumped in ready for that.
Yes, so very similar to Victoria's point, as a parent, do you know yourself, how you were raised, your own racial identity? All of those things make a world of difference in just paying attention to how we're socialized, right? You go in the malls, or online, even paying attention to, what's the skin tone of all the Barbies or even the Legos? Like all those small things begin to socialize and send messages to ourselves, but then also to our children. And we have to be aware, like have that critical awareness and consciousness to see how we are being socialized, but then also how our kids are being socialized. And I don't know of a parent or a teacher who does not want their child to have a healthy racial identity, right? We want all kids, Black, Latin, LGBTQ, like we want all of our kids, white kids included, to have a healthy racial identity. And so it begins with conversations about who are you? How were you raised? How were you brought up? And seeing yourself as a part of the line of history. And, considering as a parent, how am I setting my kids up, my boys up to be a contributor to the society that sees the humanity and maintains the dignity in everyone, right? So I am trying to affirm them in ways that it is beautiful that their skin is Black, but that also doesn't mean that because your classmate's skin is white, that there is something wrong with them, right? So being able to name the things that have been normalized forever, but being able to name it and help them understand that who you are is good, right? In the essence of who you are, but especially for white kids and white parents, helping them to see how although some of that history, parts of our history are terrible in ways that Black folks or other folks who are oppressed, that they also have the opportunity to be the change agent, right? It could be them who does not perpetuate the ways that, white folks in history have harmed or oppressed others. And so that also begins with the conversations that you have at home, right? Moms, that means you need to talk with your spouses. Dads, you need to talk with your spouses and have some conversations about your own whiteness first. And then think about how we're going to approach this to norm some of these, to talk about the normative behaviors that happen in our households. And then how does that translate to our classrooms, right? So teachers, we need to have these conversations about our own racial identity, because we are passing down those things which we consider norm, but could be very different for another child who might be, a different race. And so I think it begins with focusing on having a healthy racial identity means that for white parents, white teachers, white families, that you need to talk about your whiteness, right? And how it has been normalized, thinking about the access and privileges that you may have had that others didn't, and how you can be right now the change agent in stopping the ways in which others can be oppressed, right? Small ways individually, but then also big ways systemically.
Stephen, can I come in here just very quickly, please?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, so I've just got a piece of work. Stephen knows I'm always grading and everything else. We're all doing this, and you asked this question around how can I? What was the question here? How can I support my child's learning about race in I put UK, not America, all right, and not make her feel guilty about being white? Okay, let me just read you this quote which I've got from one of my students from their masters. I'm really glad to this, and she was interviewing, she's an assistant head teacher or principal, and she's dealing with young children which are 11 years of age. All right, I know you're watching the time, Stephen. I'm going to be just a minute. All right, 11 years of age, young Black girls. All right, this is what she was doing as part of her focus group. Right, I'm really glad to be a Black girl now. Sometimes I'm doubtful, like last year I was in my I want to be white phrase, but I have grown out of it. I've progressed and my mental health has gotten better. So the teacher says, so what is this? I want to be white phrase. Can you explain, please? Well, I look at white people's hair and I think, I want that. I look at their beautiful fair skin, the green eyes, and I feel so jealous. Now the teacher talks about, the principal talks about, it was heartbreaking to hear this 11-year-old girl share her internal battle to accept her appearance and instead compare herself to a white counterpart. Now, why do I read you that? Well, you know what? I'm going to be just a little bit kind of difficult. I really don't care how a young white child is feeling guilty, because that is about how you as a parent or carer is able to support your young child in relation to what they're feeling. But if you feel that we have to give you a packet of tissues for just your child, just listen to what I've just said there about an 11-year-old child who's just coming into her, I'm happy to be a Black girl now. That in myself is emotional burden with that young child is dealing with. Who's going to give her a packet of tissues, and who's going to deal with her guilt of how she feels as a young Black girl? Now, this, you might think, oh, this is years ago. This is work I'm just reading now. Okay, so I just wanted to put that in because we're academics as well, sitting around this table. So we're dealing with that all the time. Thank you, Stephen.
No problem. I think that's a very good point to jump into the next question, or really not a question. I mean, it came as a question, and you could ask it. You've already answered it partly. This student says, why should white students be spared the pain, embarrassment, and problems of racism, and all the Black students have to deal with it head on? And I think that you all have answered that question. That's a burning question for many Black students. And Dr. Showunmi just pushed that, right? This idea of white families are crying about the pain or the stress of racism that it's caused by them, while the African-American community or the BIPOC community is shouldering that pain every day. And this student was frustrated asking that question, why should we? And I mean, I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that question. The only thing I have to add to that is James Baldwin's letter to his nephew, My Dungeon Shook. And if you know that work, read it, and that question will be answered. This idea of why should Blacks and other non-whites shoulder this and whites go off in blissful ignorance, or what my students talk about is this idea of blissful ignorance that whites walk in every day. So I mean, for that student or for that question, I hope that we can I hope that we've answered it. I'm going to answer these two questions together because they're from parents and they're kind of in the same space. The first question is critical race theory a way to further separate whites and people of color by naming whites as racist? And the second one is critical race theory anti-American? Why? Or anti-UK? So those two questions are in the same space, but these are coming from parents. And we can imagine the race, but I don't know the race. But
I would say no and no to both
But,
questions.
and why?
Because it's just another way to take us off track. If we start going down the rabbit hole and start asking, is critical race theory anti-English or anti-British or anti-American, it's not what we want to be asking. That's just another way of taking us off track. That's the way I look at it. But I could be somebody, because I'm not American and I'm the UK, so it could be something different. But that's what I would say. It's an insequential question. And I understand that people need to ask that, but I think it's the wrong thing. Looking through the wrong window. You need to look at the other window.
So then how do they look at that? How do they look through the other window, or how do they ask the right questions? So if these are questions coming, they are
Well, that's where John Williams, Dr.
Yes,
Williams is saying.
I was about to go to Dr. Williams.
He says, read, educate yourself.
It's reading, is educating yourself, but then you got to ask the further question, and I'll give it from an American perspective. But what is American? You really have to answer that question. What is America? Are we, a greater princes? We're trying to be. The whole goal of this experiment, as they say, is to form a more perfect union. Which means, guess what? We were already divided. That history shows us that we're built on division. We're not built on multiplicative or multiplication or addition. We're built on that. And until we start having these honest conversations, and again, I pulled this from somebody, and it was very interesting that they said this. Everyone knows the Pythagorean theorem: a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Just because you say that, does that mean you're anti-square or you're anti-rectangle? It doesn't. It means, look, at this time, we're looking at a right angle triangle to see how do we best examine the right angle triangle. That's it. And that's what we got to get out of this binary, us versus you. And again, part of critical race theory is this. One of the ways they say we fix these things is across the board. It's interdisciplinary. It's working out of the one story to the multiple stories. And you can't form a more perfect union without incorporating all the stories and getting them accurate.
Well, I like that this idea of more perfect union, right? Bringing back, or almost throwing back into the faces of the very things that the country is founded on, or is supposed to be founded on. We have in the chat another question about a proclamation or statement from the State Board of Education that they do not teach CRT to undergraduate teachers. And the question is, would that quiet the mob? If our state boards of education, if there's a statement that says we don't teach this, would it quiet the mob? I see a collective shaking hands of no. Dr. Thomas?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I don't know. I feel like this idea and all these, these ideas of using critical race theory to sow division, increase people's anger, quiet a mob, as terms of like gaslighting and deterring us from what we actually need to do to prepare teachers for the classroom. We have to look at it as for what it is and not for what it's not, and not use it as a tool that as long as we cover it up, then that means that people aren't going to be upset. People are going to be upset because people are going to be upset, and they don't need to be upset about race to be upset in this country. There's a plenty of things. We're in a pandemic. There's pick what thing do you want to be upset about? And when it comes to like a statement, I'm not concerned about ceremonial or symbolic gestures. I'm more concerned about how are we deconstructing whiteness in curriculums that teachers are being used right now? How are we looking at a teacher's racial identity as it compares to the identity of the students that they're coming in contact with? How are we using the positive aspects of diversity and race and social justice to allow that to permeate all across the curriculums? A statement to quiet a mob isn't necessarily, I'm not sure what to all think about that, but about quieting a mob, because racism has angered people of African descent since we were kidnapped and brought to this country. And so if anybody needs to be quieted and comforted and supported, it's people that look like me. And I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. No,
Can
we
I
have
add-
about 4 minutes. So, and I have a couple of questions I want to ask. So I'm gonna
Okay.
ask for very short responses. But Dr. Glass, if you had something to say, just jump in it.
I was just going to follow along with Stephanie. I think we need to not be worried about the mob, because if they're already in mob mentality, there's nothing we can do. There's not much we can do about that anyway, right? Because they're going to be upset about whatever. I think that we need to consider the reverse, or that window that Victoria was talking about. We need to be supporting the teachers who are doing this work, and they are taking the risk every day to teach historical accuracy, to include race and ethnicity and all the other intersections of identity that they're teaching in their classrooms right now. Like, those are the people that we need to be focused on, sending emails to administrators saying, my son or my daughter is having a great experience in X, Y, and Z's class because they're learning about themselves. Like, we need to be lifting up the teachers who are doing this work. We also need to be lifting up the administrators who are allowing the teachers to do this work, or the administrators who are telling the teachers to do this work, because they are the ones that are catching all the heat from the powers that be. So there's always going to be, as Carol Anderson said, there's always going to be white rage, right? Like, it's always going to be there. So we need to focus more so on organizing ourselves in a way that we are lifting up the folks who are taking the risk to do this work on a regular basis, as opposed to worry about the mob. Okay, I'm done.
Right. Well, thank you. So in the last couple of minutes of this session, I want you, some of the things that we brought up, when you say, Dr. Glass, doing this work, it begs the question of what work are you talking about, right? What is this work? And is this work critical race theory? So you have to go back to that reality. Is this work critical race theory? So, the final questions, and as I move out, as we close down, it was a Latina student who asked the question of her teacher, could they learn anything about Latino Heritage Month? But the teacher said that it is going to cause problem between white students and Latinx students. So she's sticking with the regular curriculum. And the student asked, is learning about my heritage in school critical race theory? And then she asked this question, and we don't have time to really jump into it. Why is critical race theory a bad thing? Now, this is from a student, a middle school student. She's already got this idea that critical race theory is a bad thing. And back to Dr. Williams, people just don't read, right? It's not. But as a 12-year-old, she doesn't understand, but she hears the sound bites. So one of the things that we have to do is do a better job at pushing it out. The final question I just want to pose to you is what you were hitting at, what everyone was hitting at, this idea of the difference between critical race theory and the truth about American history. Right? So what is the difference? So as Dr. Thomas is talking about this idea of, hey, I teach history, I teach social studies, but what's the difference in this between critical race theory and just teaching the truth? And that truth is uncomfortable to many whites because our curriculum has been whitewashed. So,
I want this question. Can I take
well, I mean,
But he wants all of us to speak.
Right. So I want you each have about 30 seconds, and we're gonna go over a little because it's 1:00, but this is being recorded. Anybody who has to jump off, it is okay. So I want you all to think about this question, the difference between critical race theory and the truth about teaching American or British history, policies, and the treatment of people of color. What is the difference? And that, I think, is the pivotal reality that people get caught up in. And so I'm gonna give you 30 seconds. When you see my hand goes up, that means your time is up. All right, so I'll start with Dr. Williams.
It's a simple phrase. Teaching American history means giving all perspectives. Let's say we exclude race. I'll use a perfect example, the Oregon Trail. Everyone's played that game as a kid, but no one knows the history behind why these individuals went to Oregon. That's a little homework. But something as simple as that is a lesson everyone knows, and it's a game, but it's not depicted accurately as why they left and the reasons that forced these individuals, not forced, they chose to leave and take over somebody's land. That's the difference. Understanding history and what actually happened and include all the pieces in, that's telling it accurately, and that's not critical race theory.
So you're saying multiple perspectives is not critical race theory. Got it, okay. Dr. Glass. what is the difference in critical race theory and teaching the truth about American history and policies? And
So yeah, I agree with John. If we would have done this well and right, like early years, centuries ago, we wouldn't even need critical race theory. Like we would have been able to have, you know, lessons about everything and everyone was included. So even circling back to the Latina student saying, I want to learn about my history, but the teacher saying we're going to go back to the regular curriculum, there's an issue right there because the regular curriculum does not include her history. So we have to, again, include these multiple perspectives with some historical accuracy, right? Like making sure that folks from those communities are the ones that are contributing to the curriculum, to the history.
Dr. Thomas.
So we just rewind to the beginning to learn about critical race theory again from Dr. Glass and from all that those that share. But we, simply it's a lens used, a theory used in educational research to examine race and law. It was brought into education and it began in 1970. But when we think about history, we need to look at the totality of all the experiences of not just his story, but her story, their story, our story. And that's where we need to live. And that happened before 1970. It's going to go on for eternity. And that's where we need to live and know that there is a difference.
All right, Dr. Showunmi.
Thank you. I think one of the things I would say is that it's about the actual lived experience. So if we think about CRT, it's the lived experience and being able to provide a narrative around that. And I think that's something which is significantly what CRT is about. But then in relation to history itself, in relation to the UK, well, that's centuries, kind of many, many hundreds of years old. And I think the connection between the two would be how you use your lens to be able to look at the history, which is many hundreds of years old, but the history itself is what you've already said, which is multiple layers, which then it needs to be told in an accurate way and not just a way which makes people feel good. So I think that's what I would say about that, if that's helpful. But one thing I do want to throw in, and I know you haven't said that, is the impact of all this, what it's having on people which are teachers and people in the academy who are concerned about their jobs. And I think that didn't come into there, but I think that's something which we do also need to be very aware of. We've just had somebody who's losing their job in relation to another aspect, but it wasn't CRT, but it's something else to do with equalities. So I think we do need to be aware that the way things are going, we have to be very conscious of our colleagues and support each other.
Thank you very much. So as we end, I'll just end with the three major points that people can take away. First and foremost is that critical race theory is not taught in public schools because it is not taught to undergraduate teachers. And therefore, they don't have any tools to take. Secondly, talking about race is not critical race theory. Using race as a lens to talk is not critical race theory. But we must begin to use multiple storyings, right? Multiple perspectives, as everyone has said, using these layered stories, her story, their story, his story. I love that from Dr. Thomas. And finally, looking at authentic content is not critical race theory. Just because we're looking at it authentically and with those multiple layers doesn't make it critical race theory. And we should be supporting that so that we can be a more perfect union. And so I end on that, thanking all of our panelists. You have done an excellent job. Thank you very much for your support. And thank you also for our people who've joined. I hope that you received a lot from this. And so thank you very much. And we are now signing out. You all have a wonderful day.